About Love, a short story by Anton Chekhov. This is the third and last part of the famed trilogy on and about love. At lunch next day there were very nice pies, crayfish and mutton cutlets, and while we were eating, Nicanor, the cook, came up to ask what the visitors would like for dinner. He was a man of medium height, with a puffy face and little eyes. He was close-shaven, and it looked as though his moustaches had not been shaved, but had been pulled out by the roots. Alehin told us that the beautiful Pelageya was in love with this cook. As he drank and was of a violent character, she did not want to marry him, but was willing to live with him without. He was very devout, and his religious convictions would not allow him to live in sin. He insisted on her marrying him and would consent to nothing else. And when he was drunk, he used to abuse her and even beat her. Whenever he got drunk, she used to hide upstairs and sob, and on such occasions, Alehin and the servants stayed in the house to be ready to defend her in case of necessity. We began talking about love. "How love is born," said Alehin. "Why Pelageya does not love somebody more like herself in her spiritual and external qualities, and why she fell in love with Nicanor, that ugly snout. We all call him the Snout. How far questions of personal happiness are of consequence in love, all that is known. One can take what view one likes of it. So far, only one incontestable truth has been uttered about love. This is a great mystery. Everything else that has been written or said about love is not a conclusion, but only a statement of questions which have remained unanswered. The explanation which would seem to fit one case does not apply in a dozen others, and the very best thing, to my mind, would be to explain every case individually without attempting to generalize. We ought, as the doctors say, to individualize each case." "Perfectly true," Birkin assented. "We Russians of the educated class have a partiality for these questions that remain unanswered. Love is usually poeticized, decorated with roses, nightingales. We Russians decorate our loves with these momentous questions and select the most uninteresting of them, too. In Moscow, when I was a student, I had a friend who shared my life, a charming lady, and every time I took her in my arms, she was thinking what I would allow her a month for housekeeping and what was the price of beef a pound. In the same way, when we are in love, we are never tired of asking ourselves questions, whether it is honorable or dishonorable, sensible or stupid, what this love is leading up to, and so on. Whether it is a good thing or not, I don't know, but that it is in the way, unsatisfactory and irritating, I do know." It looked as though he wanted to tell some story. People who lead a solitary existence always have something in their hearts which they are eager to talk about. In town, bachelors visit the baths and the restaurants on purpose to talk, and sometimes tell the most interesting things to bath attendants and waiters. In the country, as a rule, they unbosom themselves to their guests. Now, from the window, we could see a grey sky, trees drenched in the rain. In such weather, we could go nowhere, and there was nothing for us to do but to tell stories and to listen. "I have lived at Sofino and been farming for a long time," Alehin began, "ever since I left the university. I am an idle gentleman by education, a studious person by disposition. But there was a big debt owing on the estate when I came here, and as my father was in debt partly because he had spent so much on my education, I resolved not to go away, but to work till I paid off the debt. I made up my mind to this and set to work, not, I must confess, without some repugnance. The land here does not yield much, and if one is not to farm at a loss, one must employ serf labor or hired laborers, which is almost the same thing, or put it on a peasant footing, that is, work the fields oneself and with one's family. There is no middle path. But in those days I did not go into such subtleties. I did not leave a clod of earth unturned. I gathered together all the peasants, men and women from the neighboring villages. The work went on at a tremendous pace. I myself ploughed and sowed and reaped, and was bored doing it, and frowned with disgust, like a village cat driven by hunger to eat cucumbers in the kitchen garden. My body ached, and I slept as I walked. At first, it seemed to me that I could easily reconcile this life of toil with my cultured habits. To do so, I thought, all that is necessary is to maintain a certain external order in life. I established myself upstairs here in the best rooms and ordered them to bring me their coffee and liquor after lunch and dinner, and when I went to bed, I read every night the Yeznik Evropy. But one day, our priest, Father Ivan, came and drank up all my liquor at one sitting, and the Yesnik Evropy went to the priest's daughters. As in the summer, especially at the haymaking, I did not succeed in getting to my bed at all, and slept in the sledge in the barn, or somewhere in the forester's lodge. What chance was there of reading? Little by little I moved downstairs, began dining in the servants' kitchen, and of my former luxury nothing is left but the servants who were in my father's service, and whom it would be painful to turn away. In the first years I was elected here an honorary justice of the peace. I used to have to go to the town and take part in the sessions of the Congress and of the Circuit Court, and this was a pleasant change for me. When you live here for 2 or 3 months without a break, especially in the winter, you begin at last to pine for a black coat. And in the Circuit Court, there were frock coats and uniforms and dress coats too, all lawyers, men who have received a general education. I had someone to talk to. After sleeping in the sledge and dining in the kitchen, to sit in an armchair in clean linen, in thin boots, with a chain on one's waistcoat, is such luxury. I received a warm welcome in the town. I made friends eagerly, and of all my acquaintanceships the most intimate, and to tell the truth, the most agreeable to me was my acquaintance with Luganovich, the vice-president of the Circuit Court. You both know him, a most charming personality. It all happened just after a celebrated case of incendiarism. The preliminary investigation lasted 2 days. We were exhausted. Luganovich looked at me and said, "Look here, come round to dinner with me." This was unexpected, as I knew Luganovich very little, only officially, and I had never been to his house. I only just went to my hotel room to change and went off to dinner. And here it was my lot to meet Anna Alexievna, Luganovich's wife. At that time she was still very young, not more than 22, and her first baby had been born just 6 months before. It is all a thing of the past, and now I should find it difficult to define what there was so exceptional in her, what it was in her attracted me so much. At the time, at dinner, it was all perfectly clear to me. I saw a lovely young, good, intelligent, fascinating woman, such as I had never met before, and I felt her at once, someone close and already familiar, as though that face, those cordial, intelligent eyes, I had seen somewhere in my childhood, in the album which lay on my mother's chest of drawers. 4 Jews were charged with being incendiaries, were regarded as a gang of robbers, and to my mind, quite groundlessly. At dinner I was very much excited, I was uncomfortable, and I don't know what I said, but Anna Alexievna kept shaking her head and saying to her husband, "Dmitri, how is this?" Luganovich is a good-natured man, one of those simple-hearted people who firmly maintain the opinion that once a man is charged before a court, he is guilty, and to express doubt of the correctness of a sentence cannot be done except in legal form on paper, and not at dinner and in private conversation. "You and I did not set fire to the place," he said softly, "and you see we are not condemned and not in prison." And both husband and wife tried to make me eat and drink as much as possible, from some trifling details, from the way they made the coffee together, for instance, and from the way they understood each other at half a word, I could gather that they lived in harmony and comfort, and that they were glad of a visitor. After dinner, they played a duet on the piano, then it got dark, and I went home. That was at the beginning of spring. After that, I spent the whole summer at Sofino without a break, and I had no time to think of the town either, but the memory of the graceful, fair-haired woman remained in my mind all those days. I did not think of her, but it was as though her light shadow were lying on my heart. In the late autumn, there was a theatrical performance for some charitable object in the town. I went into the governor's box. I was invited to go there in the interval. I looked, and there was Anna Alexievna sitting beside the governor's wife, and again the same irresistible, thrilling impression of beauty and sweet, caressing eyes, and again the same feeling of nearness. We sat side by side, then went to the foyer. "You've grown thinner," she said. "Have you been ill?" "Yes, I've had rheumatism in my shoulder, and in rainy weather I can't sleep." "You look dispirited. In the spring, when you came to dinner, you were younger, more confident. You were full of eagerness, and talked a great deal then. You were very interesting, and I really must confess I was a little carried away by you. For some reason you often came back to my memory during the summer, and when I was getting ready for the theatre today, I thought I should see you." And she laughed. "But you look dispirited today," she repeated. "It makes you seem older." The next day I lunched at the Luganovich. After lunch they drove out to their summer villa in order to make arrangements there for the winter, and I went with them. I returned with them to the town, and at midnight drank tea with them in quiet domestic surroundings, while the fire glowed, and the young mother kept going to see if her baby girl was asleep. And after that, every time I went to town, I never failed to visit the Luganovich. They grew used to me, and I grew used to them. As a rule, I went in unannounced, as though I were one of the family. "Who is there?" I would hear from a faraway room in the drawling voice that seemed to me so lovely. "It is Pavel Konstantinovitch," answered the maid or the nurse. Anna Alexievna would come out to me with an anxious face and would ask every time, "Why is it so long since you have been? Has anything happened?" Her eyes, the elegant, refined hand she gave me, her indoor dress, the way she did her hair, her voice, her step, always produced the same impression on me of something new and extraordinary in my life, and very important. We talked together for hours, were silent, thinking each our own thoughts, or she played for hours to me on the piano. If there were no one at home, I stayed and waited, talked to the nurse, played with the child, or lay on the sofa in the study and read. And when Anna Alexievna came back, I met her in the hall, took all her parcels from her, and for some reason I carried those parcels every time with as much love, with as much solemnity as a boy. There is a proverb that if a peasant woman has no troubles, she will buy a pig. The Luganovichs had no troubles, so they made friends with me. If I did not come to the town, I must be ill, or something must have happened to me, and both of them were extremely anxious. They were worried that I, an educated man with a knowledge of languages, should, instead of devoting myself to science or literary work, live in the country, rush round like a squirrel in a rage, work hard with never a penny to show for it. They fancied that I was unhappy, and that I only talked, laughed, and ate to conceal my sufferings, and even at cheerful moments when I felt happy I was aware of their searching eyes fixed upon me. They were particularly touching when I really was depressed, when I was being worried by some creditor or had not money enough to pay interest on the proper day. The two of them, husband and wife, would whisper together at the window. Then he would come to me and say with a grave face, "If you really are in need of money at the moment, Pavel Konstantinovitch, my wife and I beg you not to hesitate to borrow from us." And he would blush to his ears with emotion. And it would happen that after whispering in the same way at the window, he would come up to me with red ears and say, "My wife and I earnestly beg you to accept this present." And he would give me studs, a cigar case, or a lamp, and I would send them game, butter, and flowers from the country. They both, by the way, had considerable means of their own. In early days I often borrowed money and was not very particular about it, borrowed wherever I could, but nothing in the world would have induced me to borrow from the Luganovichs. But why talk of it? I was unhappy. At home, in the fields, in the barn, I thought of her. I tried to understand the mystery of a beautiful, intelligent young woman's marrying someone so uninteresting, almost an old man, her husband was over 40, and having children by him. To understand the mystery of this uninteresting, good, simple-hearted man who argued with such wearisome good sense at balls and evening parties kept near the more solid people, looking listless and superfluous, with a submissive, uninterested expression, as though he had been brought there for sale, who yet believed in his right to be happy, to have children by her. And I kept trying to understand why she had met him first, and not me, and why such a terrible mistake in our lives need have happened. And when I went to the town, I saw every time from her eyes that she was expecting me, and she would confess to me herself that she had had a peculiar feeling all that day, and had guessed that I should come. We talked a long time, and were silent, yet we did not confess our love to each other, but timidly and jealously concealed it. We were afraid of everything that might reveal our secret to ourselves. I loved her tenderly, deeply, but I reflected and kept asking myself what our love could lead to if we had not the strength to fight against it. It seemed to be incredible that my gentle, sad love could all at once coarsely break up the even tenor of the life of her husband, her children, and all the household in which I was so loved and trusted. Would it be honorable? She would go away with me, but where? Where could I take her? It would have been a different matter if I had had a beautiful, interesting life. If, for instance, I had been struggling for the emancipation of my country, or had been a celebrated man of science, an artist, or a painter. But as it was, it would mean taking her from one everyday humdrum life to another as humdrum, or perhaps more so. And how long would our happiness last? What would happen to her in case I was ill, in case I died, or if we simply grew cold to one another? And she apparently reasoned in the same way. She thought of her husband, her children, and of her mother, who loved the husband like a son. If she abandoned herself to her feelings, she would have to lie, or else to tell the truth, and in her position, either would have been equally terrible and inconvenient. And she was tormented by the question whether her love would bring me happiness. Would she not complicate my life, which, as it was hard enough and full of all sorts of trouble? She fancied she was not young enough for me, that she was not industrious nor energetic enough to begin a new life, and she often talked to her husband of the importance of my marrying a girl of intelligence and merit, who would be a capable housewife and a help to me, and she would immediately add that it would be difficult to find such a girl in the whole town. Meanwhile, the years were passing. Anna Alexievna already had 2 children. When I arrived at the Luganoviches, the servants smiled cordially. The children shouted that Uncle Pavel Konstantinovich had come and hung on my neck. Everyone was overjoyed. They did not understand what was passing in my soul and thought that I, too, was happy. Everyone looked on me as a noble being, and grown-ups and children alike felt that a noble being was walking about their rooms, and that gave a peculiar charm to their manner towards me, as though in my presence their life, too, was purer and more beautiful. Anna Alexievna and I used to go to the theatre together, always walking there. We used to sit side by side in the stalls, our shoulders touching. I would take the opera glass from her hands without a word, and feel at that minute that she was near me, that she was mine, that we could not live without each other. But by some strange misunderstanding, when we came out of the theatre, we always said goodbye and parted as though we were strangers. Goodness knows what people were saying about us in the town already, but there was not a word of truth in it all. In the latter years, Anna Alexievna took to going away for frequent visits to her mother or to her sister. She began to suffer from low spirits. She began to recognize that her life was spoilt and unsatisfied, and at times she did not care to see her husband nor her children. She was already being treated for neurasthenia. We were silent and still silent, and in the presence of outsiders, she displayed a strange irritation in regard to me. Whatever I talked about, she disagreed with me, and if I had an argument, she sided with my opponent. If I dropped anything, she would say coldly, "I congratulate you." If I forgot to take the opera glass when we were going to the theatre, she would say afterwards, "I knew you would forget it." Luckily or unluckily, there is nothing in our lives that does not end sooner or later. The time of parting came, as Luganovich was appointed president in one of the western provinces. They had to sell their furniture, their horses, their summer villa. When they drove out to the villa, and afterwards looked back as they were going away to look for the last time at the garden, at the green roof, everyone was sad, and I realized that I had to say goodbye not only to the villa. It was arranged that at the end of August we should see Anna Alexievna off to the Crimea, where the doctors were sending her, and that a little later Luganovich and the children would set off for the western province. We were a great crowd to see Anna Alexievna off. When she had said goodbye to her husband and her children, and there was only a minute left before the third bell, I ran into a compartment to put a basket, which she had almost forgotten, on the rack, and I had to say goodbye. When our eyes met in the compartment, our spiritual fortitude deserted us both. I took her in my arms. She pressed her face to my breast, and tears flowed from her eyes. Kissing her face, her shoulders, her hands wet with tears, oh, how unhappy we were. I confessed my love for her, and with a burning pain in my heart, I realized how unnecessary, how petty, and how deceptive all that had hindered us from loving was. I understood that when you love, you must either, in your reasonings about that love, start from what is highest, from what is more important than happiness or unhappiness, sin or virtue in their accepted meaning, or you must not reason at all. I kissed her for the last time, pressed her hand, and parted forever. The train had already started. I went into the next compartment. It was empty, and until I reached the next station, I sat there crying. Then I walked home to Sofino. While Alehin was telling his story, the rain left off and the sun came out. Birkin and Ivan Ivanovitch went out on the balcony, from which there was a beautiful view over the garden and the mill pond, which was shining now in the sunshine like a mirror. They admired it, and at the same time they were sorry that this man with the kind, clever eyes, who had told them this story with such genuine feeling, should be rushing round and round this huge estate like a squirrel on a wheel, instead of devoting himself to science or something else, which would have made his life more pleasant. And they thought what a sorrowful face Anna Alexievna must have had when he said goodbye to her in the railway carriage and kissed her face and shoulders. Both of them had met her in the town, and Birkin knew her and thought her beautiful. The Bishop, a short story by Anton Chekhov. 1. The evening service was being celebrated on the eve of Palm Sunday in the old Petrovsky convent. When they began distributing the palm, it was close upon 10 o'clock. The candles were burning dimly. The wicks wanted snuffing. It was all in a sort of mist. In the twilight of the church, the crowd seemed heaving like the sea, and to Bishop Pyotr, who had been unwell for the last 3 days, it seemed that all the faces, old and young, men's and women's, were alike, that everyone who came up for the palm had the same expression in his eyes. In the mist, he could not see the doors. The crowd kept moving and looked as though there were no end to it. The female choir was singing, a nun was reading the prayers for the day. How stifling, how hot it was, how long the service went on. Bishop Pyotr was tired. His breathing was laboured and rapid, his throat was parched, his shoulders ached with weariness, his legs were trembling, and it disturbed him unpleasantly when a religious maniac uttered occasional shrieks in the gallery. And then, all of a sudden, as though in a dream or delirium, it seemed to the bishop as though his own mother, Maria Timofyevna, whom he had not seen for 9 years, or some old woman just like his mother, came up to him out of the crowd, and after taking a palm branch from him, walked away looking at him all the while good-humouredly with a kind, joyful smile until she was lost in the crowd. And for some reason, tears flowed down his face. There was peace in his heart. Everything was well. Yet he kept gazing fixedly towards the left choir, where the prayers were being read, where in the dusk of evening you could not recognize anyone, and wept. Tears glistened on his face and on his beard. Here someone close at hand was weeping, then someone else farther away, then others and still others, and little by little the church was filled with soft weeping. And a little later, within 5 minutes, the nuns' choir was singing. No one was weeping, and everything was as before. Soon the service was over. When the bishop got into his carriage to drive home, the gay, melodious chime of the heavy, costly bells was filling the whole garden in the moonlight. The white walls, the white crosses on the tombs, the white birch trees and black shadows, and the faraway moon in the sky exactly over the convent seemed now living their own life, apart and incomprehensible, yet very near to man. It was the beginning of April, and after the warm spring day it turned cool. There was a faint touch of frost, and the breath of spring could be felt in the soft, chilly air. The road from the convent to the town was sandy. The horses had to go at a walking pace, and on both sides of the carriage in the brilliant, peaceful moonlight there were people trudging along home from church through the sand. And all was silent, sunk in thought. Everything around seemed kindly, youthful, akin, everything. Trees and sky and even the moon, and one longed to think that so it would be always. At last the carriage drove into the town and rumbled along the principal street. The shops were already shut, but at Erikin's, the millionaire shopkeepers, they were trying the new electric lights, which flickered brightly, and a crowd of people were gathered round. Then came wide, dark, deserted streets, one after another. Then the high road, the open country, the fragrance of pines. And suddenly there rose up before the bishop's eyes a white, turreted wall, and behind it a tall belfry in the full moonlight, and beside it 5 shining, golden cupolas. This was the Pankratievsky monastery, in which Bishop Pyotr lived. And here, too, high above the monastery, was the silent, dreamy moon. The carriage drove in at the gate, crunching over the sand. Here and there in the moonlight there were glimpses of dark monastic figures, and there was the sound of footsteps on the flagstones. "You know, Your Holiness, your mamma arrived while you were away," the lay brother informed the bishop as he went into his cell. "My mother? When did she come?" "Before the evening service. She asked first where you were, and then she went to the convent." "Then it was her I saw in the church just now. Oh, Lord!" And the bishop laughed with joy. "She bade me tell your Holiness," the lay brother went on, "that she would come tomorrow. She had a little girl with her, her grandchild, I suppose. They are staying at Ovsianikov's inn." "What time is it now?" "A little after 11. "Oh, how vexing." The bishop sat for a little while in the parlour, hesitating, and as it were refusing to believe it was so late. His arms and legs were stiff, his head ached. He was hot and uncomfortable. After resting a little, he went into his bedroom, and there, too, he sat a little, still thinking of his mother. He could hear the lay brother going away, and Father Sisoy coughing the other side of the wall. The monastery clock struck 1:15. The bishop changed his clothes and began reading the prayers before sleep. He read attentively those old, long, familiar prayers, and at the same time thought about his mother. She had 9 children and about 40 grandchildren. At one time, she had lived with her husband, the deacon, in a poor village. She had lived there a very long time, from the age of 17 to 60. The bishop remembered her from early childhood, almost from the age of 3, and how he had loved her. Sweet, precious childhood, always fondly remembered. Why did it, that long-past time that could never return, why did it seem brighter, fuller, and more festive than it had really been? When in his childhood or youth he had been ill, how tender and sympathetic his mother had been. And now his prayers mingled with the memories, which gleamed more and more brightly like a flame, and the prayers did not hinder his thinking of his mother. When he had finished his prayers, he undressed and lay down, and at once, as soon as it was dark, there rose before his mind his dead father, his mother, his native village Lesopoli, the creak of wheels, the bleat of sheep, the church bells on bright summer mornings, the gypsies under the window. Oh, how sweet to think of it. He remembered the priest of Lesopoli, Father Simeon, mild, gentle, kindly. He was a lean little man, while his son, a divinity student, was a huge fellow and talked in a roaring bass voice. The priest's son had flown into a rage with the cook and abused her. "Ah, you Jehud's ass." And Father Simeon, overhearing it, said not a word, and was only ashamed because he could not remember where such an ass was mentioned in the Bible. After him, the priest at Lesopoli had been Father Demian, who used to drink heavily, and at times drank till he saw green snakes, and was even nicknamed Demian Snakeseer. The schoolmaster at Lesopoli was Matvei Nikolaich, who had been a divinity student, a kind and intelligent man, but he too was a drunkard. He never beat the school children, but for some reason he always had hanging on his wall a bunch of birch twigs, and below it an utterly meaningless inscription in Latin, Betula Kinderbalsamica Secuta. He had a shaggy black dog whom he called Syntax, and His Holiness laughed. 6 miles from Lesopoli was the village Obnino with a wonder-working icon. In the summer, they used to carry the icon in procession about the neighbouring villages and ring the bells the whole day long, first in one village and then in another, and it used to seem to the bishop then that joy was quivering in the air, and he, in those days his name was Pavlusha, used to follow the icon, bareheaded and barefoot, with naive faith, with a naive smile, infinitely happy. In Obnino, he remembered now, there were always a lot of people, and the priest there, Father Alexei, to save time during Mass, used to make his deaf nephew Ilarion read the names of those for whose health or whose souls peace prayers were asked. Ilarion used to read them, now and then getting a 5 or 10 kopeck piece for the service, and only when he was grey and bald, when life was nearly over, he suddenly saw written on one of the pieces of paper, "What a fool you are, Ilarion." Up to 15 at least, Pavlusha was undeveloped and idle at his lessons, so much so that they thought of taking him away from the clerical school and putting him into a shop. One day, going to the post at Obnino for letters, he had stared a long time at the post office clerks and asked, "Allow me to ask, how do you get your salary? Every month or every day?" His Holiness crossed himself and turned over on the other side, trying to stop thinking and go to sleep. "My mother has come," he remembered, and laughed. The moon peeped in at the window, the floor was lighted up, and there were shadows on it. A cricket was chirping. Through the wall, Father Sisoy was snoring in the next room, and his aged snore had a sound that suggested loneliness, forlornness, even vagrancy. Sisoy had once been housekeeper to the bishop of the diocese, and was called now the former Father Housekeeper. He was 70 years old. He lived in a monastery 12 miles from the town, and stayed sometimes in the town too. He had come to the Pankratievsky monastery 3 days before, and the bishop had kept him that he might talk to him at his leisure about matters of business, about the arrangements here. At 1:30, they began ringing for matins. Father Sisoy could be heard coughing, muttering something in a discontented voice. Then he got up and walked barefoot about the rooms. "Father Sisoy," the bishop called. Sisoy went back to his room, and a little later made his appearance in his boots, with a candle. He had on his cassock over his underclothes, and on his head was an old faded skull cap. "I can't sleep," said the bishop, sitting up. "I must be unwell, and what it is I don't know. Fever." "You must have caught cold, Your Holiness. You must be rubbed with tallow." Sisoy stood a little and yawned. "Oh, Lord, forgive me, a sinner." "They had the electric lights on at Erikin's today," he said. "I don't like it." Father Sisoy was old, lean, bent, always dissatisfied with something, and his eyes were angry-looking and prominent as a crab's. "I don't like it," he said, going away. "I don't like it. Bother it." 2. Next day, Palm Sunday, the bishop took the service in the cathedral in the town. Then he visited the bishop of the diocese, then visited a very sick old lady, the widow of a general, and at last drove home. Between 1 and 2 o'clock he had welcome visitors. dining with him, his mother and his niece, Katya, a child of 8 years old. All dinner time the spring sunshine was streaming in at the windows, throwing bright light on the white tablecloth and on Katya's red hair. Through the double windows they could hear the noise of the rooks and the notes of the starlings in the garden. "It is 9 years since we have met," said the old lady, "and when I looked at you in the monastery yesterday, good Lord, you've not changed a bit, except maybe you are thinner and your beard is a little longer. Holy Mother, Queen of Heaven! Yesterday at the evening service no one could help crying. I too, as I looked at you, suddenly began crying, though I couldn't say why. His holy will." And in spite of the affectionate tone in which she said this, he could see she was constrained as though she were uncertain whether to address him formally or familiarly, to laugh or not, and that she felt herself more a deacon's widow than his mother. And Katya gazed without blinking at her uncle, his holiness, as though trying to discover what sort of a person he was. Her hair sprang up from under the comb and the velvet ribbon and stood out like a halo. She had a turned-up nose and sly eyes. The child had broken a glass before sitting down to dinner, and now her grandmother, as she talked, moved away from Katya first a wine-glass and then a tumbler. The bishop listened to his mother and remembered how many years ago she used to take him and his brothers and sisters to relations whom she considered rich. In those days, she was taken up with the care of her children, now with her grandchildren, and she had brought Katya. "Your sister Varenka has 4 children," she told him. "Katya, here, is the eldest, and your brother-in-law, Father Ivan, fell sick, God knows of what, and died 3 days before the Assumption, and my poor Varenka is left a beggar." "And how is Nicanor getting on?" the bishop asked about his eldest brother. "He is all right, thank God. Though he has nothing much, yet he can live. Only there is one thing. His son, my grandson Nicolasha, did not want to go into the church. He has gone to the university to be a doctor. He thinks it is better, but who knows? His holy will." "Nicolasha cuts up dead people," said Katya, spilling water over her knees. "Sit still, child," her grandmother observed calmly, and took the glass out of her hand. "Say a prayer, and go on eating." "How long it is since we have seen each other," said the bishop, and he tenderly stroked his mother's hand and shoulder. "And I missed you abroad, mother. I missed you dreadfully." "Thank you. I used to sit in the evenings at the open window, lonely and alone. Often there was music playing, and all at once I used to be overcome with homesickness, and felt as though I would give everything only to be at home and see you." His mother smiled, beamed, but at once she made a grave face and said, "Thank you." His mood suddenly changed. He looked at his mother and could not understand how she had come by that respectfulness, that timid expression of face. What was it for? And he did not recognize her. He felt sad and vexed. And then his head ached just as it had the day before. His legs felt fearfully tired, and the fish seemed to him stale and tasteless. He felt thirsty all the time. After dinner, 2 rich ladies, landowners, arrived and sat for an hour and a half in silence with rigid countenances. The archimandrite, a silent, rather deaf man, came to see him about business. Then they began ringing for vespers. The sun was setting behind the wood, and the day was over. When he returned from church, he hurriedly said his prayers, got into bed, and wrapped himself up as warm as possible. It was disagreeable to remember the fish he had eaten at dinner. The moonlight worried him, and then he heard talking. In an adjoining room, probably in the parlor, Father Saisoy was talking politics. "There's war among the Japanese now. They are fighting. The Japanese, my good soul, are the same as the Montenegrins. They are the same race. They were under the Turkish yoke together." And then he heard the voice of Maria Timofyevna. "So, having said our prayers and drunk tea, we went, you know, to Father Yegor at Novokatnoye. So," and she kept on saying, "having had tea," or "having drunk tea," and it seemed as though the only thing she had done in her life was to drink tea. The bishop, slowly, languidly, recalled the seminary, the academy. For 3 years he had been Greek teacher in the seminary. By that time he could not read without spectacles. Then he had become a monk. He had been made a school inspector. Then he had defended his thesis for his degree. When he was 32, he had been made rector of the seminary and consecrated archimandrite. And then his life had been so easy, so pleasant. It seemed so long, no end was in sight. Then he had begun to be ill, had grown very thin and almost blind, and by the advice of the doctors had to give up everything and go abroad. "And what then?" asked Sisoy in the next room. "Then we drank tea," answered Maria Timofyevna. "Good gracious, you've got a green beard," said Katya suddenly in surprise, and she laughed. The bishop remembered that the grey-headed Father Sisoy's beard really had a shade of green in it, and he laughed. "God have mercy upon us, what we have to put up with this girl," said Sisoy aloud, getting angry. "Spoilt child! Sit quiet." The bishop remembered the perfectly new white church in which he had conducted the services while living abroad. He remembered the sound of the warm sea. In his flat, he had 5 lofty light rooms. In his study, he had a new writing table, lots of books. He had read a great deal and often written. And he remembered how he had pined for his native land, how a blind beggar woman had played the guitar under his window every day and sung of love, and how, as he listened, he had always, for some reason, thought of the past. But 8 years had passed, and he had been called back to Russia, and now he was a suffragan bishop, and all the past had retreated far away into the mist as though it were a dream. Father Sisoy came into the bedroom with a candle. "I say," he said, wondering, "are you asleep already, Your Holiness?" "What is it?" "Why, it's still early, 10 o'clock or less. I bought a candle today. I wanted to rub you with tallow." "I am in a fever," said the bishop, and he sat up. "I really ought to have something. My head is bad." Sisoy took off the bishop's shirt and began rubbing his chest and back with tallow. "That's the way. That's the way," he said. "Lord Jesus Christ, that's the way. I walked to the town today. I was at what's-his-name's, the chief priest Sidonsky's. I had tea with him. I don't like him. Lord Jesus Christ, that's the way. I don't like him." 3. The bishop of the diocese, a very fat old man, was ill with rheumatism or gout and had been in bed for over a month. Bishop Pyotr went to see him almost every day and saw all who came to ask his help. And now that he was unwell, he was struck by the emptiness, the triviality of everything which they asked, and for which they wept. He was vexed at their ignorance, their timidity. And all this useless, petty business oppressed him by the mass of it, and it seemed to him that now he understood the diocesan bishop, who had once in his young days written on the doctrines of the freedom of the will, and now seemed to be all lost in trivialities, to have forgotten everything, and to have no thoughts of religion. The bishop must have lost touch with Russian life while he was abroad. He did not find it easy. The peasants seemed to him coarse, the women who sought his help dull and stupid, the seminarists and their teachers uncultivated and at times savage. And the documents coming in and going out were reckoned by tens of thousands. And what documents they were! The higher clergy in the whole diocese gave the priests, young and old, and even their wives and children, marks for their behavior, a 5, a 4, and sometimes even a 3. And about this he had to talk and to read and write serious reports. And there was positively not 1 minute to spare. His soul was troubled all day long, and the bishop was only at peace when he was in church. He could not get used, either, to the awe which, through no wish of his own, he inspired in people in spite of his quiet, modest disposition. All the people in the province seemed to him little, scared, and guilty when he looked at them. Everyone was timid in his presence, even the old chief priests. Everyone flopped at his feet, and not long previously an old lady, a village priest's wife who had come to consult him, was so overcome by awe that she could not utter a single word and went empty away. And he, who could never in his sermons bring himself to speak ill of people, never reproached anyone because he was so sorry for them, was moved to fury with the people who came to consult him, lost his temper, and flung their petitions on the floor. The whole time he had been here, not one person had spoken to him genuinely, simply as to a human being. Even his old mother seemed now not the same. And why, he wondered, did she chatter away to Sisoy and laugh so much? While with him, her son, she was grave and usually silent and constrained, which did not suit her at all. The only person who behaved freely with him and said what he meant was old Sisoy, who had spent his whole life in the presence of bishops and had outlived 11 of them. And so the bishop was at ease with him, although, of course, he was a tedious and nonsensical man. After the service on Tuesday, His Holiness Pyotr was in the diocesan bishop's house receiving petitions there. He got excited and angry and then drove home. He was as unwell as before. He longed to be in bed, but he had hardly reached home when he was informed that a young merchant called Erakin, who subscribed liberally to charities, had come to see him about a very important matter. The bishop had to see him. Erakin stayed about an hour, talked very loud, almost shouted, and it was difficult to understand what he said. "God grant it may," he said as he went away. "Most essential. According to circumstances, Your Holiness, I trust it may." After him came the Mother Superior from a distant convent, and when she had gone, they began ringing for vespers. He had to go to church. In the evening, the monks sang harmoniously, with inspiration. A young priest with a black beard conducted the service, and the bishop, hearing of the bridegroom who comes at midnight and of the heavenly mansion adorned for the festival, felt no repentance for his sins, no tribulation, but peace at heart and tranquility. And he was carried back in thought to the distant past, to his childhood and youth, when, too, they used to sing of the bridegroom and of the heavenly mansion. And now that past rose up before him, living, fair and joyful as in all likelihood it never had been. And perhaps in the other world, in the life to come, we shall think of the distant past, of our life here, with the same feeling. Who knows? The bishop was sitting near the altar. It was dark. Tears flowed down his face. He thought that here he had attained everything a man in his position could attain. He had faith, and yet everything was not clear. Something was lacking still. He did not want to die, and he still felt that he had missed what was most important, something of which he had dimly dreamed in the past, and he was troubled by the same hopes for the future as he had felt in childhood, at the academy and abroad. "How well they sing today," he thought, listening to the singing. "How nice it is." 4. On Thursday he celebrated Mass in the cathedral. It was the washing of feet. When the service was over and the people were going home, it was sunny, warm. The water gurgled in the gutters, and the unceasing trilling of the larks, tender, telling of peace, rose from the fields outside the town. The trees were already awakening and smiling a welcome, while above them the infinite, fathomless blue sky stretched into the distance, God knows whither. On reaching home, His Holiness drank some tea, then changed his clothes, lay down on his bed, and told the lay brother to close the shutters on the windows. The bedroom was darkened. But what weariness, what pain in his legs and his back, a chill, heavy pain, what a noise in his ears. He had not slept for a long time, for a very long time, as it seemed to him now, and some trifling detail which haunted his brain as soon as his eyes were closed prevented him from sleeping. As on the day before, sounds reached him from the adjoining rooms through the walls, voices, the jingle of glasses and teaspoons. Maria Timofyevna was gaily telling Father Sisoy some story with quaint turns of speech, while the latter answered in a grumpy, ill-humoured voice, "Bother them. Not likely. What next?" and the bishop again felt vexed and then hurt that with other people his old mother behaved in a simple, ordinary way. While with him, her son, she was shy, spoke little, and did not say what she meant, and even, as he fancied, had during all those 3 days kept trying in his presence to find an excuse for standing up because she was embarrassed at sitting before him. And his father? He too, probably, if he had been living, would not have been able to utter a word in the bishop's presence. Something fell down on the floor in the adjoining room and was broken. Katya must have dropped a cup or a saucer, for Father Sysoy suddenly spat and said angrily, "What a regular nuisance the child is! Lord, forgive my transgressions. One can't provide enough for her." Then all was quiet. The only sounds came from outside. And when the bishop opened his eyes, he saw Katya in his room, standing motionless, staring at him. Her red hair, as usual, stood up from under the comb like a halo. "Is that you, Katya?" he asked. "Who is it downstairs who keeps opening and shutting a door?" "I don't hear it," answered Katya, and she listened. "There, someone has just passed by." "But that was a noise in your stomach, uncle." He laughed and stroked her on the head. "So you say Cousin Nikolasha cuts up dead people?" he asked after a pause. "Yes, he is studying." "And is he kind?" "Oh, yes, he's kind, but he drinks vodka awfully." "And what was it your father died of?" Papa was weak and very, very thin, and all at once his throat was bad. I was ill then too, and brother Fedya. We all had bad throats. Papa died, uncle, and we got well. Her chin began quivering, and tears gleamed in her eyes and trickled down her cheeks. "Your Holiness," she said in a shrill voice, by now weeping bitterly. "Uncle, mother, and all of us are left very wretched. Give us a little money. Do be kind. Uncle darling." He, too, was moved to tears, and for a long time was too much touched to speak. Then he stroked her on the head, patted her on the shoulder, and said, very, good, my child. When the Holy Easter comes, we will talk it over. I will help you. I will help you." His mother came in quietly, timidly, and prayed before the icon. Noticing that he was not sleeping, she said, "Won't you have a drop of soup?" "No, thank you," he answered. "I am not hungry." "You seem to be unwell, now I look at you." "I should think so. You may well be ill." "The whole day on your legs, the whole day. And my goodness, it makes one's heart ache even to look at you." "Well, Easter is not far off. You will rest then, please God. Then we will have a talk too. But now I'm not going to disturb you with my chatter. Come along, Katya, let His Holiness sleep a little." And he remembered how once, very long ago, when he was a boy, she had spoken exactly like that, in the same jestingly respectful tone, with a church dignitary. Only from her extraordinarily kind eyes and the timid, anxious glance she stole at him as she went out of the room could one have guessed that this was his mother. He shut his eyes and seemed to sleep, but twice heard the clock strike and Father Sysoy coughing the other side of the wall. And once more his mother came in and looked timidly at him for a minute. Someone drove up to the steps, as he could hear, in a coach or in a chaise. Suddenly, a knock, the door slammed, the lay brother came into the bedroom. "Your Holiness," he called. "Well?" "The horses are here. It's time for the evening service." "What o'clock is it?" 7:15. He dressed and drove to the cathedral. During all the 12 Gospels, he had to stand in the middle of the church without moving, and the first Gospel, the longest and the most beautiful, he read himself. A mood of confidence and courage came over him. That first Gospel, "Now is the Son of Man glorified," he knew by heart. And as he read, he raised his eyes from time to time, and saw on both sides a perfect sea of lights, and heard the splutter of candles. But, as in past years, he could not see the people, and it seemed as though these were all the same people as had been round him in those days, in his childhood and his youth, that they would always be the same every year, until such time as God only knew. His father had been a deacon, his grandfather a priest, his great-grandfather a deacon, and his whole family, perhaps from the days when Christianity had been accepted in Russia, had belonged to the priesthood, and his love for the church services, for the priesthood, for the peal of the bells, was deep in him, ineradicable, innate. In church, particularly when he took part in the service, he felt vigorous, of good cheer, happy. So it was now. Only when the eighth gospel had been read, he felt that his voice had grown weak, even his cough was inaudible. His head had begun to ache intensely, and he was troubled by a fear that he might fall down, and his legs were indeed quite numb, so that by degrees he ceased to feel them, and could not understand how or on what he was standing, and why he did not fall. It was 11:45 when the service was over. When he reached home, the bishop undressed and went to bed at once without even saying his prayers. He could not speak, and felt that he could not have stood up. When he had covered his head with the quilt, he felt a sudden longing to be abroad, an insufferable longing. He felt that he would give his life not to see those pitiful, cheap shutters, those low ceilings, not to smell that heavy monastery smell. If only there were one person to whom he could have talked, have opened his heart. For a long while he heard footsteps in the next room, and could not tell whose they were. At last the door opened, and Sysoy came in with a candle and a teacup in his hand. "You are in bed already, Your Holiness?" he asked. "Here I have come to rub you with spirit and vinegar. A thorough rubbing does a great deal of good. Lord Jesus Christ! That's the way. That's the way. I've just been in our monastery. I don't like it. I'm going away from here tomorrow, Your Holiness. I don't want to stay longer. Lord Jesus Christ! That's the way." Sysoy could never stay long in the same place, and he felt as though he had been a whole year in the Pankratievsky monastery. Above all, listening to him, it was difficult to understand where his home was, whether he cared for anyone or anything, whether he believed in God. He did not know himself why he was a monk, and indeed he did not think about it, and the time when he had become a monk had long passed out of his memory. It seemed as though he had been born a monk. "I'm going away tomorrow. God be with them all. I should like to talk to you. I can't find the time," said the bishop softly with an effort. "I don't know anything or anybody here. I'll stay till Sunday if you like. So be it. But I don't want to stay longer. I am sick of them." "I ought not to be a bishop," said the bishop softly. "I ought to have been a village priest, a deacon, or simply a monk. All this oppresses me, oppresses me." "What? Lord Jesus Christ! That's the way. Come, sleep well, Your Holiness. What's the good of talking? It's no use. Good night." The bishop did not sleep all night, and at 8 o'clock in the morning he began to have hemorrhage from the bowels. The lay brother was alarmed and ran first to the archimandrite, then for the monastery doctor, Ivan Andreyich, who lived in the town. The doctor, a stout old man with a long grey beard, made a prolonged examination of the bishop and kept shaking his head and frowning, then said, "Do you know, Your Holiness, you have got typhoid?" After an hour or so of hemorrhage, the bishop looked much thinner, paler, and wasted. His face looked wrinkled, his eyes looked bigger, and he seemed older, shorter, and it seemed to him that he was thinner, weaker, more insignificant than anyone, that everything that had been had retreated far, far away, and would never go on again, or be repeated. "How good," he thought, "how good." His old mother came. Seeing his wrinkled face and his big eyes, she was frightened. She fell on her knees by the bed and began kissing his face, his shoulders, his hands. And to her, too, it seemed that he was thinner, weaker, and more insignificant than anyone, and now she forgot that he was a bishop and kissed him as though he were a child very near and very dear to her. "Pavlusha, darling," she said, "my own, my darling son, why are you like this? Pavlusha, answer me." Katya, pale and severe, stood beside her, unable to understand what was the matter with her uncle, why there was such a look of suffering on her grandmother's face, why she was saying such sad and touching things. By now he could not utter a word, he could understand nothing, and he imagined he was a simple, ordinary man, that he was walking quickly, cheerfully through the fields, tapping with his stick, while above him was the open sky bathed in sunshine, and that he was free now as a bird and could go where he liked. "Pavlusha, my darling son, answer me," the old woman was saying. "What is it? My own." "Don't disturb his holiness," Seesoy said angrily, walking about the room. "Let him sleep. What's the use? It's no good." 3 doctors arrived, consulted together, and went away again. The day was long, incredibly long. Then the night came on and passed, slowly, slowly, and towards morning. On Saturday, the lay brother went in to the old mother who was lying on the sofa in the parlour and asked her to go into the bedroom. The bishop had just breathed his last. Next day was Easter Sunday. There were 42 churches and 6 monasteries in the town. The sonorous, joyful clang of the bells hung over the town from morning till night unceasingly, setting the spring air a-quiver. The birds were singing, the sun was shining brightly. The big market square was noisy, swings were going, barrel organs were playing, accordions were squeaking, drunken voices were shouting. After midday, people began driving up and down the principal street. In short, all was merriment. Everything was satisfactory, just as it had been the year before, and as it will be in all likelihood next year. A month later, a new suffragan bishop was appointed, and no one thought anything more of Bishop Pyotr, and afterwards he was completely forgotten. And only the dead man's old mother, who is living today with her son-in-law, the deacon, in a remote little district town, when she goes out at night to bring her cow in and meets other women at the pasture, begins talking of her children and her grandchildren, and says that she had a son, a bishop, and this she says timidly, afraid that she may not be believed. And indeed, there are some who do not believe her,